Baron Trump sat at the window seat in the first-class cabin, his tall frame slightly hunched as he flipped through the thick pages of a book. Lost in thought, he seemed unaware of the judgmental gaze fixed on him from across the aisle. The flight from New York to Los Angeles was beginning to settle into its usual rhythm, the flight attendants hustling to serve drinks, passengers adjusting their seats, and the steady hum of the engines creating a constant background noise. Among the passengers was Greg Miller, a self-proclaimed liberal activist who prided himself on calling out perceived privilege wherever it appeared. When he spotted Baron Trump, the youngest son of the former president, seated comfortably in first class, it instantly rubbed Greg the wrong way. Greg had made a name for himself online, often critiquing the excesses of the wealthy and powerful. Seeing Baron Trump, a teenager, living in such luxury seemed to epitomize everything Greg stood against. To Greg, it wasn't just a plain seat. It was a symbol of unearned privilege, generational wealth, and a name that opened doors effortlessly. His indignation grew with every glance at the young man seated across from him. "Figures," Greg muttered under his breath, loud enough for the passenger beside him to hear. "Born with a silver spoon, probably thinks the world owes him." The woman sitting next to Greg glanced up from her magazine, but said nothing. Greg took her silence as agreement and leaned back in his seat, already crafting a tweet in his mind about this perfect example of privilege in action. What Greg didn't know, and couldn't have possibly guessed, was that Baron Trump's presence on this flight was far from the indulgence he assumed it to be. Now in his late teens, Baron had quietly grown into a thoughtful, conscientious young man who often avoided the spotlight. His demeanor was reserved, almost shy, as he flipped another page of his book. There was, however, a reason for his presence on this flight, one that would completely upend Greg's assumptions. As the flight attendants began their rounds offering drinks and snacks, Greg's eyes drifted to Baron again. He couldn't help but notice when Baron politely declined a glass of sparkling water, instead opting for plain water with a quiet "thank you." The simplicity of the gesture didn't fit the narrative Greg had built in his mind. He'd expected arrogance, entitlement, maybe even a dismissive attitude toward the staff. But all he saw was quiet courtesy. Unable to resist, Greg leaned slightly into the aisle, pretending to stretch, and caught Baron's eye. "So, reading anything interesting?" Greg asked, his tone casual but laced with judgment. Baron looked up, startled for a moment, before offering a small smile. "Just a book on architecture," he replied, his voice deeper than Greg had expected, steady and calm. "Architecture, huh?" Greg raised an eyebrow. "Planning to design another Trump Tower?" The question lingered in the air, and for a moment, Baron seemed unsure of how to respond. But instead of taking offense, he nodded slightly. "Something like that," he said, "but not quite the way you're thinking." Greg's curiosity was piqued, despite himself. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but it certainly wasn't this measured, almost humble response. "Oh," he prompted. "What way am I thinking?" Baron hesitated, as though weighing whether to continue. Finally, he closed his book and rested his hands on top of it. "I've been studying sustainable design," he said. "Buildings that use less energy, recycle water, and blend into their surroundings. I think architecture can do a lot to help the environment if we're thoughtful about it." For a moment, Greg was taken aback. He had expected some defensive excess or maybe a comment about wealth and power. Instead, he was hearing about sustainability and thoughtful design, a far cry from the image he'd built in his head. "Interesting," Greg said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Didn't expect that answer." Baron shrugged. "A lot of people don't." The conversation might have ended there if not for a sudden jolt of turbulence that made the plane shake briefly. A few passengers let out startled gasps as the turbulence hit. Greg gripped the armrest, his usual bravado replaced momentarily by a flicker of fear. Baron, on the other hand, remained calm, his expression unchanged as he glanced out the window. "Happens all the time," Baron said reassuringly. "Nothing to worry about." Greg forced out a laugh, feeling slightly embarrassed by his own reaction. "You seem pretty calm about it." Baron offered a faint smile. "I've flown a lot. You get used to it." Greg nodded, still feeling off balance. Not from the turbulence, but from how this young man seemed to challenge every assumption Greg had made. He found himself wondering just how many other things he had gotten wrong. As the flight continued, Greg couldn't help but steal glances at Barron, who had gone back to his book. There was a quiet intensity about him, a focus that didn't fit the image of a spoiled, entitled teenager. Greg felt a pang of guilt as he remembered the quick assumptions he'd made, based on nothing more than a name and a seat in first class. When the flight attendants came around with the meal service, Greg noticed something else that struck him. While many passengers, himself included, barely acknowledged the crew beyond placing their orders, Barron made sure to make eye contact and thank each attendant who stopped by his seat. It was a small thing, but it stood out to Greg. He was beginning to realize just how much he had underestimated this young man. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Greg's indignation had softened into curiosity. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Barron Trump than met the eye, and now, he found himself wanting to know what that might be. The assumptions he'd made so confidently at the start of the flight now seemed shallow and unfair, based solely on his own biases. Breaking the silence, Greg asked again, "What got you into architecture?" Barron looked up, a hint of surprise in his expression. "It's something I've always been interested in," he said. "But I guess it really started when I visited some old buildings with my mom. She's always been into history and art. She taught me to understand how much thought goes into creating something that truly lasts." Greg nodded slowly. "And now you're studying sustainable design?" Barron's face lit up slightly, and for the first time, Greg saw a spark of passion in him. "Yeah," Barron said. "I think we have a responsibility to take care of the world we've been given. Architecture is just one way to do that, but it's a powerful one. Buildings can inspire people, bring them together, and even help heal the planet if we do it right." The sincerity in Barron's voice was unmistakable, and Greg felt a twinge of shame as he thought about the tweet he had been planning to post. He realized just how unfair it would have been to reduce this young man to a stereotype, to judge him based only on his last name. But Greg wasn't ready to admit that yet. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the image he'd had when he boarded the plane and the reality he was now facing. There was still a part of him that wanted to find a flaw, a reason to justify his initial assumptions, but with each passing minute, that part was growing smaller, drowned out by the quiet integrity of the young man sitting across the aisle. The flight was far from over, and Greg had a feeling this was just the beginning of a journey he hadn't expected to take. Greg couldn't stop thinking about the things Barron had just shared. The young man's passion for sustainable architecture wasn't just impressive, it was disarming. Greg had boarded the plane ready to confirm every stereotype he held about the Trumps. But with every exchange, Barron was chipping away at those assumptions. And yet, Greg's skepticism lingered like a stubborn shadow, one he couldn't shake. "A responsibility to take care of the world we've been given," Greg muttered to himself, repeating Barron's words. It was such an unexpected sentiment from someone whose family name was often associated with excess and opulence. He glanced over again, watching as Barron resumed reading, his focus unbroken. The kid had a way of seeming older than his years, more mature than Greg had anticipated. Another round of turbulence rippled through the cabin, prompting a chorus of murmurs and a few nervous laughs from the passengers. Greg instinctively gripped the armrest again, his nerves on edge. Across the aisle, Barron barely reacted. His calm demeanor remained unchanged. Greg wondered if this young man had always been this composed, or if it was something he had learned over time. Maybe growing up in a family that was constantly in the public eye forced you to develop a thick skin. "You've got a steady hand," Greg said, leaning slightly into the aisle again. "You've got to tell me something. How do you stay so calm during turbulence? You're like a rock over there." Barron looked up, amusement flickering in his blue eyes. "I guess I've had a lot of practice," he said. "I've been flying since I was a kid. After a while, you learn to trust the plane. It's designed to handle this stuff." Greg nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "Trust the plane, huh? Easier said than done." Barron chuckled softly. "It helps to focus on something else," he said, gesturing to his book. "Reading usually does the trick for me." Greg's gaze drifted to the book in Barron's hands. He could just make out the title, The Architecture of Happiness by Alain de Botton. The choice surprised him. It wasn't a textbook or a technical manual, it was a philosophical exploration of how buildings influence our emotions and well-being. It was the kind of book Greg might have picked up himself, back when he had more time for reading. "That's a good one," Greg said, nodding toward the book. De Botton's got a way of making you see the world differently. Barron's expression brightened slightly, and he set the book down on his lap. "You've read it a while ago," Greg admitted. "I remember thinking it was fascinating, how something as simple as a building could have such a big impact on people." Barron nodded. "Exactly. It's not just about walls and roofs. It's about creating spaces that make people feel connected, safe, inspired. That's what I want to do." Greg felt another pang of guilt as he listened. This kid wasn't the shallow, entitled figure he'd imagined. He was thoughtful, articulate, and genuinely passionate about his goals. Greg's assumptions were crumbling faster than he could rebuild them, leaving him with an uncomfortable sense of self-awareness. As the flight went on, Greg found himself drawn into more conversation with Barron. They talked about architecture, of course, but also about other topics, art, history, and even music. Barron's knowledge was broad, and his curiosity seemed boundless. He wasn't just interested in talking about himself. He asked Greg questions too, showing a real interest in his perspective. "So, what about you?" Barron asked at one point, tilting his head slightly. "What do you do?" The question caught Greg off guard. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of curiosity, especially from someone he'd been so quick to judge. "I'm a writer," he said after a moment. "Mostly opinion pieces and social commentary." Barron's eyes lit up. "That's cool. What do you write about?" Greg hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain his work without revealing the biases that had colored his initial impression of Barron. "A little bit of everything," he said vaguely. "Politics, culture, social issues, stuff like that." "That sounds interesting," Barron said. "Do you get to travel a lot for your work?" "Sometimes," Greg replied. "But not as much as I'd like. Most of the time I'm behind a computer, trying to make sense of the world in 800 words or less." Barron smiled. "That's a tough job, trying to explain complex ideas in a way people can understand." Greg was struck by the sincerity in Barron's voice. It wasn't the empty flattery he'd expected, but a genuine appreciation for the challenges of his profession. It was yet another reminder that this young man was nothing like the caricature Greg had envisioned. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Greg realized that he'd spent almost the entire flight talking to Barron. The hours had flown by, and his initial resentment had been replaced by a reluctant admiration. Barron was smart, grounded, and refreshingly unpretentious. He had a quiet confidence that didn't need to be announced or flaunted. And Greg found himself wondering how someone so young had managed to develop such a strong sense of self. The flight attendants made their final rounds, collecting empty cups. As the captain's voice came over the intercom, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts, Greg glanced out the window, watching as the city's lights began to appear. He felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude for the unexpected connection he'd made, and guilt for the way he'd judged Barron so harshly at the start of the flight. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Greg turned to Barron one last time. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I just wanted to say thanks for the conversation." Barron looked up, his expression warm.
"Thank you," he said.
"I enjoyed it." Greg hesitated, then added, "And sorry for how I acted earlier. I made some assumptions about you that weren't fair." Barron's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't seem offended.
"It's okay," he said.
People do that a lot. The simplicity of the response hit Greg harder than he expected. Barron's calm acceptance of other people's biases spoke volumes about his character. Greg could only nod, unsure of what else to say. The plane came to a stop, and the passengers began gathering their belongings. Greg watched as Barron tucked his book into his bag and stood up. His tall frame unfolded gracefully. Despite his youth, there was an air of composure about him that Greg couldn't help but admire. As they filed off the plane, Greg found himself walking beside Barron. "Good luck with your studies," he said. "I'm sure you'll do great things." Barron smiled. Thanks, and good luck with your writing. They parted ways at the terminal, and Greg stood for a moment, watching as Barron disappeared into the crowd. He felt a strange sense of loss, as if he had just let go of something important. But he also felt inspired in a way he hadn't expected. Barron Trump had challenged his assumptions, forced him to confront his own biases, and reminded him that people were often far more complex than they seemed. Greg pulled out his phone and Greg opened Twitter, staring at the blank text box for a moment before he began typing. But this time, his words weren't driven by anger or judgment. Instead, they were an attempt to capture the unexpected lesson he'd learned at 35,000 feet. As Greg walked through the bustling airport terminal, the encounter with Barron lingered in his mind, replaying over and over again. He found himself dissecting the nuances of their conversation, surprised by how much it had impacted him. Barron Trump had turned out to be nothing like what Greg had imagined. The teenager's quiet intelligence and thoughtful demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the preconceived image Greg had carried with him onto the flight. It wasn't just the specifics of what Barron had said. It was the way he carried himself, the calm self-assuredness that seemed to radiate from him without an ounce of arrogance. As Greg made his way to the baggage claim, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. It wasn't often that someone challenged him so profoundly. As a writer, he was used to being the one shaping narratives, crafting opinions, and dissecting public figures from the comfort of his keyboard. But Barron had, in his understated way, flipped the script. Greg felt exposed. His own biases laid bare in a way that was both humbling and uncomfortable. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his Twitter draft. Earlier, when he'd first spotted Barron in the first-class cabin, Greg had been quick to type out a snarky observation, ready to broadcast his judgment to his followers. The tweet was still there, unfinished and unsent, an artifact of his initial assumptions. Greg stared at it for a moment before deleting it with a decisive swipe. Somehow those words now felt small and petty, now far from the truth he had come to understand. Lost in thought, Greg hardly noticed the carousel starting to spin, the mechanical hum blending into the background noise of the airport. He reached for his bag absent-mindedly, then paused when he caught sight of Barron again, standing just a few feet away. The young man was retrieving his own luggage, a simple black suitcase that looked as unremarkable as its owner. Greg hesitated for a moment, unsure of why he felt compelled to say something more. He approached, and with a voice cutting through the chatter of the terminal, he said, "Hey." Barron turned, his expression neutral but polite. "I just wanted to say it was nice talking to you on the flight," Greg added. Barron's lips curved into a small smile. "You too," he replied. "Thanks for the conversation." Greg shifted awkwardly, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and regret. "Listen," he began, "I owe you an apology. I made some snap judgments about you earlier, and they weren't fair. You proved me wrong, and I'm glad you did." Barron regarded him thoughtfully, his steady blue eyes locking with his. "It's okay," he said after a beat. "People do that a lot. Comes with the territory." There was no bitterness in Barron's tone, just quiet acceptance, and it made Greg's guilt deepen. "Still," he said, "I wanted to say it anyway. And for what it's worth, I think you're going to do great things." Barron nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you. That means a lot." They exchanged a final handshake, and Greg watched as Barron walked away, his tall figure disappearing into the crowd. It was a brief moment, but it left Greg feeling strangely uplifted. For all his cynicism and skepticism, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something rare, a glimpse of someone who genuinely wanted to make the world a better place. As Greg exited the airport, and as he hailed a cab, Greg found himself replaying the interaction over and over again. He thought about the stories he'd written, the angles he'd taken, and the assumptions he'd made over the years. How many times had he reduced people to one-dimensional caricatures, overlooking the depth and humanity that lay beneath the surface? It was a sobering thought, one that made him question not just his work, but his entire worldview. The cab ride to his hotel was uneventful, giving Greg plenty of time to reflect. By the time he checked in and reached his room, He felt a strange restlessness, a need to put his thoughts into words. He pulled out his laptop and opened a blank document, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. For once, he didn't know where to start. The encounter with Barron was still too fresh, too raw to distill into a neat narrative. But Greg knew one thing. He wanted to write about it. Not as a takedown or an expose, but as an honest reflection of what he had learned. The words began to flow, tentative at first, but gaining momentum as Greg delved deeper into his thoughts. He wrote about the flight, about his initial assumptions, and about the quiet grace with which Barron had defied them. He described the teenager's passion for architecture, his thoughtful perspective on sustainability, and the way he'd handled Greg's pointed questions with maturity beyond his years. But most of all, Greg wrote about the lesson he had taken away, the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not who he thought they should be. By the time Greg finished, the document was several pages long, and the sun was beginning to set outside his hotel window. He leaned back in his chair, reading over what he'd written. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it felt honest. For once, Greg wasn't trying to craft a viral headline or a biting critique. He was simply telling a story, one that had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. Greg saved the document and closed his laptop, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. The encounter with Barron had been brief, just a few hours on a plane, but it had left a lasting impression. He knew he wouldn't forget it anytime soon. The next morning, Greg woke up early, still thinking about Barron. He decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would help him process everything. Los Angeles was as bustling as ever, the streets alive with activity. Greg wandered aimlessly, his thoughts drifting back to the conversation on the plane. He thought about Barron's calm demeanor, his thoughtful answers, and the way Barron had handled Greg's skepticism with such quiet confidence lingered in Greg's mind. As he passed a small coffee shop, he decided to step inside and grab a drink. The line was long, giving him plenty of time to observe the people around him. He couldn't help but wonder how many of them were carrying stories as complex and unexpected as Barron's. It was a humbling thought, one that sparked in Greg a renewed sense of responsibility as a writer. His words had power, the power to shape narratives, to influence opinions, and to challenge or reinforce stereotypes. He realized, now, that he'd been too quick to wield that power without truly considering the consequences. When Greg finally reached the counter, he ordered a black coffee and found a seat near the window. He sipped his drink slowly, watching the world go by outside. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his usual deadlines and metrics. He wanted to write stories that mattered, stories that revealed the complexity of the human experience, rather than reducing it to sound bites and headlines. As the day went on, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Barron was just the beginning of something much bigger. He didn't know what form it would take, but he felt certain it would shape the way he approached his work moving forward. For now, all he could do was take it one step at a time, starting with a story he'd written the night before. Later that evening, Greg opened his laptop again and reread his draft. He made a few edits, refining the language and tightening the narrative, but he resisted the urge to overpolish it. He wanted the story to feel real, to capture the authenticity of the moment. When he was satisfied, he saved the final version and prepared to send it to his editor. But just before hitting send, Greg paused. He thought about Barron, the way the young man had handled himself on the flight, and the quiet wisdom he'd shared. Greg realized this wasn't just a story about Barron Trump. It was a story about himself, about the biases he'd confronted, and the lessons he'd learned stayed with Greg, and as he clicked send, he felt a sense of resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the way he approached the future, and that, he decided, was a good place to begin. The days following Greg's flight passed in a blur of routine, yet his thoughts constantly returned to Barron Trump. It wasn't just the surprise of meeting someone so different from what he'd expected. It was the realization that his own perspective had been so narrow. The conversation on the plane had sparked something within him, a desire to examine the biases he carried and how they shaped his work. Greg's editor was quick to approve the piece he'd written about the encounter. It was published under the headline Unexpected Wisdom at 35,000 Feet, a lesson from Barron Trump. The article struck a chord with readers, drawing comments that ranged from supportive to skeptical. Some applauded Greg's candor, while others accused him of being naive. But the most surprising reaction came from Barron himself. 2 weeks after the article went live, Greg received an email with the subject line "Thank you." The sender's name, Barron T. His heart skipped a beat. He opened the email, unsure of what to expect. "Hi, Greg. I read your article, and I wanted to thank you for writing it. It's not often that people take the time to look beyond the surface, especially when it comes to my family. Your words meant a lot, not just to me, but to my mom as well. She's always encouraged me to stay grounded and focus on what really matters, and it was nice to see that reflected in your piece. I hope our conversation helped you as much as it helped me. If you're ever in New York again, let me know. I'd love to continue our discussion. All the best, Barron." Greg read the email twice, then a third time. His emotions shifted between surprise and gratitude. He hadn't expected any response, let alone one so heartfelt. He took a moment to gather his thoughts before. Greg hit reply and typed, "Hi, Barron. Thank you for your kind words. I'm really glad the article resonated with both you and your mom. Our conversation definitely left a big impact on me. It's not every day that someone challenges your assumptions in such a meaningful way. If I'm ever in New York, I'll definitely reach out. Until then, I wish you all the best with your studies and your goals. I have no doubt you'll accomplish great things.
Take care, Greg."
After hitting send, Greg felt a sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. The email exchange marked the start of a correspondence that would continue on and off over the next few months. Their conversations varied from updates on Barron's studies to Greg's thoughts on the state of journalism. It was an unlikely friendship, yet one that both men seemed to cherish in their own way. Meanwhile, Greg's article continued to gain traction, sparking debates on the nature of privilege, bias, and the importance of seeing people as individuals. Some critics accused Greg of being too forgiving, while others praised his willingness to admit his mistakes. For Greg, the experience served as a reminder of the power of storytelling and the responsibility it carried. Then, one day, Greg received an unexpected invitation. Barron was giving a talk at a sustainability conference in New York and had invited Greg to attend as his guest. The email was simple but sincere. "Hi, Greg. I'm speaking at the Green Cities Conference next month, and I thought of you. The talk will focus on sustainable architecture and how we can design for a better future. It would mean a lot if you could be there. Let me know if you're interested, and I'll arrange everything. Best, Barron." Greg didn't think twice. He replied with an enthusiastic yes, eager to see Barron in a new light. The conference was being held in a sleek, modern venue in Manhattan, and Greg arrived early, wanting to take it all in. The room was filled with architects, designers, and environmentalists, all buzzing with anticipation. When Barron took the stage, Greg couldn't help but be struck by how poised he looked. Dressed in a tailored suit, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence Greg had noticed on the plane, but now, there was something else. A sense of purpose filled the room. "Good morning," Barron began, his voice steady and clear. "Today, I want to talk about the role of architecture in shaping not just our cities, but our future. We often think of buildings as static, unchanging structures, but the truth is, they have the power to inspire, to connect, and to heal. And as we face the challenges of climate change, it's more important than ever to rethink how we design and build." Greg listened, captivated, as Barron delved into the details of his vision. He spoke about renewable materials, energy-efficient designs, and the importance of creating spaces that prioritize people over profit. Barron shared examples of projects he admired and outlined his own plans for the future. But what stood out the most was the passion in his voice, a passion that couldn't possibly be faked. When the talk ended, the audience erupted into applause. Barron's words had clearly struck a chord, and Greg felt a surge of pride as he watched the young man accept the accolades with grace. It was a far cry from the image Greg had carried onto that plane just months ago. He couldn't help but marvel at how much his perspective had shifted after the session. Barron met Greg in the lobby, his face lighting up as he spotted him. You made it, he exclaimed, extending a hand. I wouldn't have missed it, Greg replied, shaking his hand warmly. You are incredible up there.
I'm not just saying that.
Barron smiled, his cheeks flushing slightly. Thanks, that really means a lot coming from you. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, surrounded by the energy of the conference, but lost in their own world. Greg couldn't recall the last time he'd felt so inspired. Barron's vision for a better future was infectious, and Greg found himself wanting to be a part of it in some way. As the day came to an end, Greg realized that the story he'd written months ago was just the beginning. Barron's journey was far from over, and Greg knew he'd be watching with keen interest as the young man continued to defy expectations and make his mark on the world. For Greg, it was a reminder that the most meaningful stories were the ones that didn't have neat endings. They were the ones that kept unfolding, challenging you to grow and see the world in new ways. As he left the conference, Greg felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wanted to keep telling stories that mattered, stories that revealed the humanity in everyone. And in that moment, he realized just how much he had Barron Trump to thank for that.